A millionaire CEO thought his life was under control, until he found twin girls and a baby in an alley, and they refused to let him walk away. The day had begun like any other for Aidan Ford, the powerful and polished CEO of Ford Global. His schedule was tightly packed, his driver waiting outside at exactly 7 a.m., and his assistant already texting updates by the time his espresso finished brewing. The city was gray that morning, with a thick fog curling between the buildings like smoke. Aidan had chosen to walk the last few blocks to clear his head before a crucial meeting. His light beige suit stood out sharply against the dull backdrop of the city. As he took a shortcut through a narrow alley between two old brick buildings, a route he never used but took that day on impulse, he caught sight of something that made him pause mid-stride. Huddled against a graffiti-covered wall were two little girls, maybe 6 years old, identical in every detail, brown hair tangled with wind, green eyes wide and frightened, bare knees scraped and dirty. They clung to each other like anchors in a storm. In the arms of one girl, bundled tightly in a faded blue blanket, was a baby, no more than 6 months old, crying weakly but steadily. The scene hit Aidan like a fist to the chest. These children didn't belong here. Not in this alley. Not alone. He approached cautiously, hands slightly raised as though not to scare them, though his $1,000 shoes were already soaked from the puddles beneath him. The girls flinched at first, their eyes darting toward the shadows, as if expecting someone else, someone they feared more than a stranger. "Hey," he said gently, kneeling down. "I'm not here to hurt you. Are you all right?" The one holding the baby didn't speak but looked up at him with an expression that didn't match her age, an expression of practiced silence and exhaustion. The other girl finally answered, her voice small and cracked. "We don't have anywhere to go." Aidan's mind raced. He asked their names. Lily and Skylar. Twin sisters. They didn't know how long they had been out there, only that they'd been sleeping behind dumpsters and eating whatever they could find. Their mother had died, they said, and their dad had left days ago, promising to come back and never returning. The baby was their brother, Benjamin. He had been crying on and off for hours, and they didn't know how to feed him anymore. Aidan stared at them, his throat tightening with something unfamiliar. He wasn't sure what disturbed him more, the facts of what he was hearing or the calm way they spoke, as if all of it were normal. He tried calling child services, only to be told there was no immediate placement available that could take all three together. The system was overwhelmed, the voice on the other end explained. He could wait at a nearby station, or a patrol car could collect them within a few hours. Aidan looked at the girls again, chilled to the bone, barefoot, the baby still crying, and felt something snap inside him. "No," he said aloud, to no one in particular. "They're not sitting here for 3 hours." He scooped Benjamin carefully into his arms, and when the girls hesitated, he said, "You're coming with me. Just for a little while. Somewhere warm. Somewhere safe." The twins looked at each other, then at him. Aidan Ford, the man known for his unshakable logic, for never making emotional decisions, had just made one without a second thought. And so, with 2 frightened little girls and a screaming infant in tow, he stepped out of the alley and into a day that would change everything he thought he knew about success, purpose, and family. Aidan didn't fully register the weight of what he was doing until the elevator doors of his building closed behind him, silencing the chaos of the city. The ride up to the top floor felt unusually long, though it lasted less than a minute. He stood there in his spotless suit, cradling a 6-month-old baby whose cries had quieted only slightly. Beside him, Lily and Skylar stood stiff and silent, their eyes darting around the sleek mirrored walls, their small hands clenched into the fabric of their worn clothes. They looked completely out of place, and he knew it. His penthouse, with its glass walls, minimalist design, and pristine floors, had never welcomed children before. It had never needed to. When the doors opened, the girls hesitated before stepping out. "It's okay," Aidan said softly, motioning them in. "This is my home. You can stay here for now." They crossed the threshold with the hesitancy of children used to being unwelcome. The contrast was staggering, two frail little girls and an infant entering a space designed for silence and solitude. Aiden's assistant had texted 4 times about his missed meeting, but he didn't reply. Instead, he focused entirely on finding a blanket, something warm, something soft. His hands, usually steady with negotiations worth millions, shook as he unwrapped Benjamin's blanket and saw how thin and underfed the baby was. He laid the baby gently on the couch and asked the girls when they'd last eaten. "Yesterday morning," Skylar murmured, not meeting his eyes. Aiden went to the kitchen and opened the fridge, which offered nothing helpful: protein shakes, bottled water, a few containers of catered meals. No milk, no baby formula, nothing a child could or should eat. He left the twins on the couch with the television turned low on a cartoon channel and wrapped Benjamin in a fresh towel, then took the baby in his arms and headed back to the elevator. On the way down, he placed an emergency grocery order on his phone and called a nearby pharmacy. He didn't care what it cost, he just needed it immediately. Within half an hour, he returned with bags full of diapers, formula, snacks, juice, wipes, and clothes. The clerk had looked at him strangely, asking if everything was all right, and for the first time, he had no rehearsed answer. Back upstairs, he made bottles for the baby using the instructions on the formula box, his expensive shirt streaked with milk by the time he figured out how to screw the cap on right. When he handed it to Benjamin and the baby latched on hungrily, a strange feeling flooded through him, part awe, part guilt, part protectiveness he didn't know he was capable of. Lily and Skylar sat at the kitchen island with juice boxes and crackers, watching him in stunned silence. Eventually, Lily spoke up. "Why are you helping us?" Her voice wasn't angry. It wasn't even curious. It was cautious, the kind of question that expected abandonment. Aiden paused. "Because someone should have already," he said. "And because I don't want to walk away from you." The girls didn't smile, but something shifted. He saw it in the way Skylar leaned slightly toward her sister instead of pulling away. He saw it in the way Lily began to relax her grip on her plastic cup. These were small signs, but they mattered. Later that evening, he got them into warm baths, an experience that took every ounce of his patience, and laid out new clothes on the bed in the guest room. He had no idea if they'd fit. When they emerged, hair damp, cheeks pink from the warmth, they looked like different children. Still unsure, still scared, but no longer cold. No longer outside. He put Benjamin in a borrowed crib, a delivery rushed from a local store, and sat in the hallway afterward, his head in his hands. The reality of what he had done was beginning to settle in. These children had no one. And by taking them in, even temporarily, he had become someone. It terrified him. But it also gave him a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in years. When he finally walked past the guest room, he saw the girls curled up together on the bed, the baby sleeping soundly between them. Aiden leaned against the doorframe and watched them breathe. He had run an empire, traveled the world, and sat at tables with presidents and kings. But tonight, watching 3 children sleep in a room that wasn't built for them, he felt the weight of something far more profound. Responsibility. And a strange, quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, he was about to become something more than a man in a suit. Morning arrived with soft light breaking through the tall windows of Aiden's penthouse, illuminating the modern furniture and polished floors that still looked untouched despite the presence of 3 children. Aiden had barely slept. He had sat awake most of the night in the armchair beside the guest room, watching over them, listening for any signs of distress. His mind, usually filled with numbers and strategy, was now swimming with images of tiny hands, soft whimpers, and the constant question echoing inside him, what now? He had taken them in impulsively, yes, but not carelessly. And now, he had to figure out what it meant to keep them safe, not for one night, but maybe for many more. The girls woke slowly, blinking at the bright light, their bodies still wrapped around the baby who had miraculously slept through the night. Aiden made oatmeal for breakfast, not because he knew how, but because it seemed simple enough, and he had found a recipe online at 3 in the morning. He nearly burned it, added too much cinnamon, and forgot to check if the girls were allergic to anything, but when he placed the steaming bowls on the table and motioned them over, they came. Quietly. Carefully. As though waiting for the permission to belong. They ate slowly, glancing up at him from time to time as if trying to understand who he was when he wasn't rescuing them from an alley. He tried to make conversation, asking simple things, what shows they liked, if they had favorite colors, whether Benjamin liked music. Skylar, more guarded, gave short, clipped answers. Lily was a little more open, occasionally nodding or whispering, but both girls still held that layer of practice distance, the kind that came from being let down too many times. After breakfast, Aiden sat down and called his legal team. He explained the situation, not with the urgency of a man needing a contract signed, but with the deep discomfort of someone revealing a part of himself he'd kept hidden for too long. The lawyer on the other end was stunned but assured him they'd look into temporary guardianship extensions and the first steps toward long-term custody options. But there would be complications, background checks, home visits, assessments, and potential family members who might come forward. The system didn't move quickly, and children could be moved at any moment if someone deemed it in their best interest. Aiden's hand tightened around the phone. He had never felt so powerless in his life. Not in business. Not in negotiation. But this was different. These were lives, not assets. And the thought of the girls being taken from him, sent to a shelter or split up across foster homes, made something primal rise inside him, a kind of protectiveness he hadn't known he possessed. By mid-morning, he took them to a pediatric clinic. The doctor was kind, gentle, and visibly surprised when Aiden introduced himself as just trying to help them for now. Benjamin was underweight but healthy. The girls were behind on vaccinations but otherwise physically okay. Psychologically, however, the doctor gave Aiden a long, meaningful look and said, "They've clearly been through a lot. Stability is everything now. Even more than food." That word, stability, echoed in Aiden's mind as they returned home. His penthouse was elegant, secure, and spotless, but was it stable? He had built a life of success and efficiency, but not of warmth. He thought about the empty second bedroom, the fact that his fridge had never once stored juice boxes or fruit snacks, the absence of any framed photos on his walls. His world had been curated for solitude, and now it had to become something it had never been, a place that felt like home. That evening, he let them help him decorate. He brought out boxes from storage, old art pieces he never hung, a few dusty vases, and let them pick where things should go. Skylar lined books on the coffee table in rainbow order. Lily placed a plant by the window. They giggled when Aiden fumbled while hammering a hook into the wall and shouted in triumph when they hung up their first drawing, a lopsided house with 3 stick figures and a very round baby. Later, as they curled up on the couch in pajamas too big for them, Aiden read aloud from a children's book he'd downloaded in desperation. His voice was stiff at first, unsure, but the rhythm began to come. And when he looked over and saw both girls resting their heads on either side of him, eyes heavy, bodies finally relaxed, he felt something strange and grounding. He had once thought power was control. Now, as he sat in a circle of warmth, chaos, and the fragile beginnings of trust, he realized true power was presence. Not knowing what to do and staying anyway. Not being perfect and showing up anyway. And in that moment, he made a quiet promise, he wouldn't let them go. Not without a fight. Not while they still needed someone to choose them without condition. The days that followed fell into a strange, fragile rhythm. Aiden found himself waking up earlier than usual, not to read market reports or draft emails, but to warm bottles, check for missing socks, and carefully brush tangles from 2 small heads of brown hair. His mornings no longer began with news alerts or international phone calls, but with tiny voices calling his name from the hallway, or the low, tired cries of baby Benjamin needing to be fed. The structure of his life had been completely rewritten, not by decision, but by necessity. And he didn't resist it. In fact, he began to crave the simplicity of these chaotic, honest new routines. He quickly realized that children didn't fit neatly into the blocks of time his calendar was used to. Nothing about caring for 3 young lives was predictable. Some days were easy, full of laughter, coloring books, spilled juice, and cartoons. But other days brought tantrums that erupted out of nowhere, inconsolable tears from the baby, and hours spent trying to coax the girls into sleep when they were clearly haunted by things they wouldn't say aloud. Aiden was used to solving problems with meetings and logic. Now, he was learning that sometimes all he could do was sit beside them, quietly, until the storm passed. And sometimes, that was enough. At night, once the children were finally asleep, he would stand in the hallway outside the guest room for long minutes just listening to their breathing. There was a stillness to those moments that he couldn't quite name, equal parts peace and fear. He was doing something he had never trained for, something far removed from the world he had once believed made him powerful. And yet, every time Lily reached for his hand without thinking, or Skylar laughed at something he said, or Benjamin fell asleep curled against his chest, he felt like he had stepped into a part of himself that had been dormant for years. Still, not everything was easy. His work life had started to fray around the edges. His board had questions. Investors were unsettled. His assistant, who had loyally followed his every instruction for years, began sending messages that sounded more and more like veiled concern. "You missed a call with Tokyo," one message read. "Do you want me to reschedule or delegate?" He didn't reply. Not because he didn't care, but because he was beginning to realize that maybe, for once, the business could wait. One evening, as he was cleaning up spilled cereal from under the kitchen island, he found Lily sitting on the floor in the corner, hugging her knees. When he knelt beside her and asked what was wrong, she looked up at him with eyes far too old for her age and said, "People always leave." He didn't know what to say at first. Every sentence that came to mind sounded too big, too permanent, or too empty. So instead, he just sat beside her and said quietly, "I'm here now." She didn't respond, but after a few minutes, she leaned her head against his shoulder. He didn't move until she did. The next day, they drew pictures together. Aiden wasn't good at it, but the girls didn't care. They laughed when he messed up the hands or made animals look ridiculous. At one point, Skylar handed him her drawing and said, "It's our new house." It was a stick figure version of his penthouse, complete with big windows and a smiling sun. "You drew me?" he asked, pointing to the tall figure. She nodded and said simply, "Because you didn't go away." He stared at the paper longer than he meant to, his throat suddenly tight. That night, after putting the kids to bed, he stood in front of the mirror in his bedroom. His suit jacket was still hanging over the chair where he had tossed it 3 days earlier. His tie hadn't been touched. The reflection staring back at him was tired, with dark circles under his eyes and a kind of uncertainty he wasn't used to seeing. But there was something else there, too. A softness. A depth. A man who had made a decision that couldn't be undone, and didn't want it to be. He was beginning to understand that love, the real kind, didn't arrive with fireworks or declarations. It came in the quiet choices, the steady presence, the willingness to be there, even when you didn't have all the answers. And as he turned off the lights and walked back to check on the children one last time before sleeping, he realized that he had already crossed the threshold. He wasn't just temporarily helping anymore. He was becoming theirs. And maybe, just maybe, they were becoming his too. The following week brought with it a fresh wave of decisions Aiden never thought he would be making in his life, not about stocks or mergers or strategic acquisitions, but about pediatricians, school enrollment paperwork, proper formula types, and how to convince 2 traumatized 6-year-olds to brush their teeth before bed without turning it into a small war. For the first time in over a decade, Aiden canceled an entire day's worth of meetings, not because of illness, not because of a sudden market drop, but simply because Lily had woken up crying and refused to let go of his hand. Something in her sobbing clung to his spine long after the sound faded. He told his assistant to reschedule everything. When she protested, he just said, "Something more important came up," and hung up without explanation. He spent that day with them in the apartment, doing what he now referred to in his head as the quiet work, helping Skylar with basic reading exercises on a tablet, feeding Benjamin strained carrots, and folding laundry that didn't belong to him but now felt just as much his responsibility as anything else. He discovered that Skylar hated loud noises, that Lily preferred to sleep with a light on, and that Benjamin would fall asleep instantly to the sound of the washing machine if you left him tucked in on the couch nearby. These weren't extraordinary revelations, but to Aidan, they were the beginnings of knowing, not managing, not controlling, but truly knowing people he was starting to care for more than anything else in his life. At one point in the afternoon, Skylar handed him a drawing she had been working on all morning. It showed 4 stick figures, 2 girls, 1 baby, and a tall man in a light brown suit. Above them was a big heart, and underneath, in crooked block letters, she had written the word ours. Aidan sat with it for a long moment. He wanted to ask her if it meant what he thought it meant, but the way she looked at him, waiting and hopeful, told him she already knew that he understood. He put the drawing on the refrigerator door with a magnet and didn't care how out of place it looked next to the clean lines and steel surfaces of his kitchen. By the end of the week, he met again with his lawyer to discuss the formal steps necessary for foster care certification and the eventual path to legal guardianship. The lawyer listened patiently as Aidan listed every detail he had documented: medical visits, their schooling history, the trauma indicators. Aidan had compiled it all in a spreadsheet, complete with color-coded sections and links to support articles he had read. At the end of the meeting, the lawyer leaned back and said, "You're not doing this like a project, Aidan. You're doing it like a father." The words didn't land right away. They echoed later, as he walked home alone, echoing louder in his chest with every step. The legal process wasn't fast. The state needed to investigate. Background checks had to be updated. Social workers would visit the home to determine if the children were being raised in a healthy environment. Aidan was told multiple times that the children could be relocated if a blood relative was found. He tried to prepare himself for that possibility, but every time he looked at Lily falling asleep with her head on his arm or Skylar braiding his tie around her doll like it was a scarf, he felt that quiet sense of panic bloom again in his chest. That weekend, Aidan took them to a park, not a private country club lawn or manicured rooftop garden, but a real, messy, loud city park filled with laughter, noise, and 100 other families. It was a crisp fall afternoon. The leaves had begun to turn, and there was a smell of roasted peanuts and damp earth in the air. The girls clutched his hands nervously at first but eventually let go when they saw the playground. Within minutes they were climbing, running, sliding, and for the first time in weeks, Aidan saw them without the weight of fear in their faces. He sat on a nearby bench with Benjamin in a carrier against his chest, watching them like his life depended on it. When a woman sitting nearby struck up conversation, asking how old his daughters were, Aidan hesitated for half a second before saying, "They're 6. It was the first time he said it that way. Not, "2 girls I'm helping" or "children staying with me temporarily." Just, "they." His daughters. The woman smiled and said he looked tired. He smiled back and admitted, "I am. But it's a good tired." That night, back at the apartment, as he helped them into pajamas and read their favorite story for the 5th time in a row, he noticed something subtle but powerful. They didn't ask if he would still be there in the morning. They didn't need to anymore. And in that, he realized the shift had already happened. It wasn't about blood or paperwork. It was about consistency. About showing up again and again until doubt had nowhere left to hide. He tucked them in, turned off the light, and as he stepped out of the room, he heard Skylar whisper to Lily, "I think we found our home." Aidan stopped in the hallway and pressed his hand to the wall, holding back the ache in his throat. He didn't need permission. He didn't need more time. He already knew. They were his. And he would never let them go. Aidan was beginning to understand that fatherhood wasn't something that arrived all at once. It crept into the spaces between tasks, grew in the quiet sacrifices, and settled into the small, unexpected moments that no one else would ever notice. It was when he remembered to cut the crust off Skylar's sandwich because she didn't like the texture. It was when he stayed up reading parenting forums at 2 in the morning, searching for ways to soothe a teething baby without medication. It was in the way Lily started leaving her drawings on his desk before heading to school, trusting he'd notice, and that it would matter. These weren't grand gestures, but they stitched together something real. Something lasting. Every weekday morning began with chaos, but Aiden learned to find rhythm in it. The sharp, rigid order of his previous life, where every second was scheduled and every meeting mapped, had softened into a new kind of structure, one that revolved around brushing teeth while dodging spilled cereal, braiding tangled hair before the school bus arrived, and making sure Benjamin had enough clean onesies to get through the day. It was exhausting in a way no boardroom ever was, but it gave back something priceless. At night, when the apartment was finally still, Aiden didn't miss the silence of his old life. He missed the noise. He missed them. Social workers had begun their visits, arriving with notebooks and polite questions and long glances across the space that was now filled with toys, child-sized chairs, and a fridge covered in finger paintings. Aiden had expected to feel judged, but instead he felt proud. Proud of how far they'd come. Proud that the home no longer looked like it belonged to someone afraid of love. He answered every question honestly, no embellishments, no performances. He didn't want approval based on illusion. He wanted it built on truth. One morning, Lily woke up with a fever. Aiden called off work immediately and spent the entire day on the couch beside her, wrapping her in blankets, cooling her forehead with a damp cloth, and reading her favorite book over and over until she finally drifted off. He hadn't cancelled a full day's responsibilities in years, not even for himself, but this time he didn't hesitate. There wasn't a single doubt in his mind that she came first. Watching her breathe, cheeks flushed with heat, he realized how terrified he would be if he ever had to let her go. That kind of love didn't ask for permission. It simply took root. Skylar had become more attached too, though she showed it differently. She didn't always ask for affection, but she watched him constantly. Every move he made, every time he poured milk or zipped a coat, she tracked it like it meant everything. It was only when he found a folded note on his desk, written in shaky letters that read, "Thank you for not leaving," that he realized how much she still feared it. He sat down that night and wrote her a letter back, just a few lines, simple words, telling her that he was here and he wasn't going anywhere. He placed it on her nightstand. She didn't mention it the next morning, but she held his hand all the way to school. The legal process moved slowly. There were endless forms, interviews, and background checks, and always the looming fear that somewhere, a distant relative might appear and lay claim to the children. Aiden had prepared for that. He knew it could happen. But knowing it didn't make it any easier to imagine. He had become a man who used to fear failure in business. Now he feared losing a bedtime routine, a Saturday at the park, the sound of laughter echoing off his once sterile walls. Benjamin was thriving. The baby had gained weight, started sitting up, and giggled every time Aiden tried to feed him with exaggerated sound effects. Aiden didn't know when it had happened, but somewhere along the way, Benjamin had stopped feeling like someone else's child. He had become his son in every way that counted. He held Aiden's thumb tightly when falling asleep, turned his head toward his voice in a crowded room, and stopped crying when Aiden walked in. The bond wasn't forced. It had formed naturally, silently, until it became undeniable. On a rainy Thursday evening, the four of them were gathered in the living room. The girls were building a blanket fort while Benjamin napped nearby. Aiden was on the floor with them, holding pieces of the fort in place while Skylar gave instructions like a miniature architect. Suddenly, Lily paused and asked, "Are we going to stay here forever?" Her voice wasn't afraid, it was hopeful, but hesitant, like she wanted to believe it but needed to hear it out loud. Aiden looked at her and didn't blink. "That's the plan," he said. "If you want to." She nodded and continued building the fort. Skylar smiled without saying anything. It was enough. That night, after they'd all fallen asleep, Aiden stood alone in the quiet of the living room, surrounded by small socks and stuffed animals and empty juice cups. He picked up Skylar's drawing from the fridge, the one with the big heart and the word ours, and stared at it again. The word meant something different now. It meant belonging. It meant future. It meant that whatever was coming, they would face it together. He didn't know what the next few months would hold. There could still be obstacles. But the doubt had faded. He had already made his choice. They were his children. His family. And no court or circumstance would ever change what they had built together, piece by imperfect piece. Winter settled over the city in slow, heavy waves. The mornings came later, the light weaker, and the wind sharp enough to steal your breath. But inside Aiden's apartment, warmth had become more than just temperature. It lived in the details now, in the way the living room was cluttered with toys, in the laundry baskets filled with mismatched socks, in the little smudged fingerprints left on the window panes by curious hands trying to catch snowflakes. What had once been a sterile, high-rise fortress for a man who prided himself on detachment had evolved into a living, breathing home. The quiet had been replaced by bedtime songs, tantrums, laughter, and the daily hum of life with 3 children. It had been nearly 3 months since Aiden had found the children in that alley. The legal process was still crawling along, but something deeper and more powerful had already shifted. They no longer saw each other as strangers who were thrown together by circumstance. They were now a unit. The girls started calling him Dad without any grand moment or ceremony. It began one night when Lily whispered it accidentally as she was falling asleep. Aiden didn't react right away, afraid that acknowledging it might make her take it back. But when Skylar started using it too, more casually, almost testing the word, he felt something unspoken settle into place. He didn't ask them to call him that. They chose it on their own. That was what made it real. Benjamin had just turned 8 months old. His cheeks were fuller, his eyes brighter, and he had started to babble more, stringing together nonsense syllables as though he were trying to catch up to his sisters. He pulled himself up on furniture now, wobbling dangerously but determined, and always let out a victorious squeal when he managed to stand. Aiden found himself watching these milestones with the kind of quiet awe he used to reserve for market victories or prestigious awards. This felt different. More honest. More earned. The girls had begun to open up about their past in fragments, usually without warning. Sometimes it came in the middle of a game, when a particular word or action would trigger a memory. Other times it happened at night, when the lights were off and their defenses were down. They never spoke much about their parents. What little they said hinted at neglect and a kind of slow abandonment that had shaped them more than any single traumatic moment. Aiden never pushed them to share more. He just listened. And he was always there the next day, doing exactly what he had done the day before, showing up. His company had finally forced a decision. The board, while sympathetic to his personal life, had made it clear that his ongoing absence was affecting operations. They offered him a compromise: step down as CEO but remain chairman of the board with a flexible schedule. It would be a public gesture, they said, a way to show he still had influence. Aiden didn't even hesitate. He accepted the offer within the hour, then left the office for the last time, not with a sense of loss, but with unexpected relief. He walked out into the snow-covered street, called the nanny to check on the kids, and went to pick up groceries like any regular father preparing dinner on a Tuesday night. That weekend, the social worker assigned to their case made an unannounced visit. Aiden was elbow-deep in cookie dough with Lily while Skylar was coloring nearby and Benjamin was gnawing on a soft toy on the floor. The apartment was messy, loud, and chaotic. The social worker observed them quietly, took a few notes, asked the girls how they were doing. They responded with ease, almost proudly showing her their favorite corners of the apartment: the bookshelf, the plant they were helping grow, the little drawer in the kitchen filled with their own forks and plates. At the end of the visit, the woman looked at Aiden and said softly, "They're not just surviving here. They're thriving." He didn't respond with a polished answer. He simply nodded and swallowed the emotion building in his throat. That night, after the kids were asleep, Aiden sat on the couch in the dim light of the kitchen, a cup of tea cooling in his hands. He stared at the small photograph Lily had taken with his phone and insisted they print, the four of them at the park, bundled in coats, faces pressed close together in a haphazard, imperfect family portrait. There was snow in Lily's hair, Skylar was mid-laugh, and Benjamin's mitten was half off. Aiden looked tired, maybe even unsure. But he was smiling, not for the camera, but from something much deeper. It wasn't just happiness. It was peace. He realized then that nothing about this life was what he had planned. It wasn't polished or efficient or predictable. It was messy and loud and inconvenient. But it was his. Fully, completely his. And no matter how many legal forms still needed signing, no matter how many visits or reviews stood ahead, in his heart there was no longer any question. This was his family. And he was already exactly where he was supposed to be. The final court hearing had been scheduled for a Wednesday morning, the kind of cold, pale day when even the sky looked hesitant. Aiden woke up before dawn, not because of nerves, but because his body had long since adjusted to the quiet rhythm of fatherhood, early mornings, soft footsteps in the hallway, the familiar sound of Benjamin stirring in his crib. He stood at the window in his kitchen with a cup of coffee in his hand, watching the sun slowly rise behind the buildings, its gold light filtering through the glass and painting the walls in warmth. Today was the day everything would either become official or fall apart. But in Aiden's mind, the decision had already been made. Not by the court, but by time. By the trust that had formed slowly between him and the children. By every bedtime story, every tear wiped away, every moment he had chosen to stay. The kids didn't sense his anxiety, or if they did, they didn't let it show. Lily and Skylar were excited, giddy even. They had picked out matching dresses with glittery sleeves and asked Aiden to fix their hair in double braids, which he did, albeit clumsily. Benjamin was bundled in a tiny navy suit that made him look like a doll, chewing happily on the edge of his toy giraffe as if the day ahead was just like any other. To them, this wasn't a courtroom or a legal process. It was just another chapter in a story that had already begun months ago, the moment Aiden had bent down in that alley and said, "You're coming with me." At the courthouse, the atmosphere was more somber. They passed security, took the elevator, walked the polished hallway to the family court, and sat on a long bench outside the hearing room. The children stuck close to Aiden, quiet now, watching the people around them. Other families waited too, some tense, others indifferent. Aiden had been through more negotiations than he could count, but this was different. He couldn't strategize his way through this. He had already given everything, his time, his heart, his future. Now all that remained was the judge's decision. The courtroom itself was smaller than Aiden had expected. Wooden benches, a high bench for the judge, a scattering of officials, and a clerk with a kind voice. When their case was called, Aiden stood and took the children with him to the front. The judge was an older woman, with sharp eyes and a tired expression, someone who had seen too many stories like this one and had learned not to trust easily. But as she read through the case file, glanced at Aiden's records, reviewed his background, and listened to the social worker's final recommendation, something softened in her face. She asked him questions. Why he had taken them in. Whether he understood what permanent guardianship meant. Whether he knew the responsibility wasn't temporary. He didn't flinch. His answers were steady, honest. He told her he had found 3 children in an alley and discovered a piece of himself he hadn't known existed. He said he wasn't perfect, that he had made mistakes, that every day was hard and unpredictable, but that he had never, not once, considered walking away. He told her he loved them. All 3 of them. And that they were not a burden. They were his life. The room fell silent after he finished speaking. The girls held on to his hands, one on each side, and Benjamin let out a loud hiccup that made everyone in the courtroom smile. The judge looked at them for a long moment, then at Aiden again, and finally spoke the words he had been waiting for. She approved the adoption. Permanently. Irrevocably. Legally and fully, the children were now his. Lily burst into tears. Skylar smiled in a way Aiden had never seen before, pure, uninhibited joy. Benjamin laughed, unaware of the gravity of the moment, and slapped his toy against the wooden table in celebration. Aiden's hands shook as he signed the final papers, not from fear, but from relief, from gratitude, from the staggering realization that this moment would define him more than anything else he had ever accomplished. Outside the courthouse, the wind had picked up, but it didn't feel cold. They walked together down the steps, hand in hand, as if gravity itself had changed. Aiden felt it in his bones. He was no longer just a man trying to do the right thing. He was a father. No longer temporary, no longer waiting for permission. It was done. It was real. It was forever. They went to the small diner down the block to celebrate, the kind of place Aiden never would have entered a year ago, but now felt like the perfect choice. The kids ordered pancakes and hot chocolate. He let them eat whipped cream straight from the can. They laughed and made a mess. Benjamin flung a spoon across the table and nearly hit a waiter. Aiden didn't care. He smiled through all of it, memorizing every detail. Later that night, back at home, the girls insisted on a family movie night. They all curled up on the couch in one big tangle of blankets and limbs. Aiden didn't even make it halfway through the movie before Lily fell asleep on his shoulder and Skylar on his chest. Benjamin was already in his crib, out cold, his breathing slow and even. Aiden didn't move. He sat there in the dark, the soft glow of the screen flickering across their faces, and realized something that brought tears to his eyes, not because he was sad, but because he finally understood. All his life, he had been chasing legacy, building empires, collecting titles. But this warmth, this weight of tiny bodies leaning into him, this quiet, ordinary night, that was his legacy. Not a corporation. Not a building with his name on it. But a life rebuilt from the broken places. He had found his purpose not in the place he was going, but in the people who had walked into his life when he least expected them and taught him how to stay. The ending of this story is not just heartwarming, it's transformative. What began as a chance encounter in a cold alley becomes a deeply human journey about healing, identity, and love chosen freely rather than inherited by blood. Aiden's evolution from a detached, high-powered CEO into a devoted, emotionally present father is handled with realism and tenderness. His change doesn't come from dramatic declarations or overnight epiphanies, but through small, honest decisions made in everyday moments, showing up for nightmares, learning how to braid hair, burning breakfast and trying again. What makes the ending powerful is its restraint. The adoption doesn't solve everything, it doesn't erase the children's trauma or Aiden's fears, but it affirms a truth the story has been building toward from the very beginning: family isn't something you find. It's something you choose, again and again, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. In a world where so many stories rely on grand gestures, this one stands out by honoring the quiet ones, the late-night feedings, the whispered reassurances, the drawings taped to the fridge. It's these small acts of love that create real transformation. And by the final scene, when Aiden finally sees his legacy not in a skyscraper or a balance sheet, but in the children asleep on his shoulder, we feel not just resolution, but deep emotional truth. This story reminds us that the most life-changing moments rarely announce themselves with fanfare. Sometimes, they begin with a single decision to care, and never stop.